figure out. I'm just going to join the meeting over there.
Okay, check and that's no.
Yeah.
We good? Excellent. Okay, well, I'm sure people will continue to arrive, but I think we can afford to get going. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming today on this cold evening for this last seminar of the Michaelmas series of Future of Food seminar talks. We will be going again next year, restarting in January, was it?
Yep.
Lexi, we'll let you know the exact date for another set of seminar series, but I'm delighted that Anna Taylor has joined us today, the Executive Director at the Food Foundation, to talk to us about challenges and opportunities with the UK government's new food strategy. So, so thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you.
To you.
Great, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Lovely to see you all and those of you online. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that we see for policy change under the banner of the government's new food strategy. Before doing that, I thought it might be just, in case you're not familiar with who the Food Foundation is and what we do. We are a charity focused on the UK, but probably most of our policy work happens at the England level. But we're really interested in changing diets ultimately towards health and sustainability. And we do that by trying to change food environments. So places where people are making decisions about what to eat. And we do that we try and change food environments by changing the actions of those actors which are listed around the circle in red. So primarily policymakers, but we also have a big business audience, particularly the big businesses in the system. We're doing increasing amounts of work with local authorities and local leaders. And we also have a coalition of investors who invest in food companies and can obviously influence to some extent with their investment behaviour how those companies behave. So we kind of work circular motions around this visual and in towards the middle, trying to get these actors to change their behaviour and affect the price and affordability, availability and appeal of healthy and sustainable food. And before all, it's very important because we've got focus on inequality really throughout all of what we do, trying to make sure that the proposals that we're coming up with are going to benefit everyone, but particularly those who've got the least money, to try and narrow some of those inequalities that we see in food in particular. That's kind of who we are. We're a group of about 20 people. We work really at the interface between academia and these actors. So we try and take evidence-based proposals to these actors, try and communicate them in powerful ways and get them to change what they do. And we do that through events, briefings, sometimes more public campaigning, lots of work in the media to try and shape the public conversation around food so that it opens up the space for policy change to happen. So I would say I'm going to start with the positives really, because I think we're making quite a lot of progress, though it feels a little bit perhaps incoherent, or at least not really part of a bigger vision at the moment. But we're seeing quite a few policy commitments in the past 12 months since the last government has come in. Some of these were started by the previous government, but we've seen in the last 12 months a sort of adding and building on some of those commitments. So particularly you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with most, if not all of these things. The expansion of advertising restrictions, which are coming in formally in January. We've now got restricted multi-buys of unhealthy foods. Big commitment that came in June, was the expansion of free school meals to all children from households on universal credit. That was something that we've been campaigning for about 8 years, so it felt like a kind of pretty huge win. The government is reviewing and updating the school food standards as well as part of that commitment. The expansion of free school meals starts next September 2026. In the NHS plan in July, we saw the commitment to introduce mandatory reporting by food companies on the healthiness of their sales, with a view to then moving to mandatory targets. Again, that was something we've been campaigning for about 4 years in that instance, and we did quite a lot of work to try and platform the voices of businesses and investors to outline why this was an important policy measure to create both a level playing field, but also to drive greater transparency to inform better policy making and investment decisions. The updating of the nutrient profile model, which is causing all kinds of stuff with the food industry at the moment, which is interesting to watch, and is a work in progress. I mean, multiples of these are just announcements, and they've all got to flow through the system into kind of concrete regulations and so forth. This is very timely right now. There's a consultation on the soft drinks industry levy. The budget, what happens as the outcome of that consultation, and whether the soft drinks industry levy will be expanded. They've uprated the Healthy Start vouchers. This is vouchers for preschool children from very low income families, a small uplift, still not big enough to align with inflation, but again, something we've been pushing hard for, and we're hoping that the child poverty strategy, which is due just after the budget, will go a bit further on that. They've included fruit and veg social prescribing in the neighbourhood plan. I'll come in and talk a little bit more about what the neighbourhood plan is in a moment, but that was quite an interesting development and came actually as a bit of a surprise. And then this sort of umbrella process, the food strategy, as yet not really delivering any new policies, though they are forthcoming, but has published, as I'm sure you're familiar with, not there, but it's coming here, this good food cycle kind of paradigm shift, really thinking about what it sets out in that paper, what the outcomes are, the 10 outcomes that the government is seeking to deliver with its food strategy, and wants to kind of turn the conversation from the junk food cycle, which Henry Dimbleby coined in his National Food Strategy published in 2021, and shift towards a good food cycle, which delivers these 10 outcomes. Now, the kind of political context, which I was going to mention next for this strategy, is kind of important to keep in mind. And these are things which we're very cognizant of as we develop and think through different policy propositions for the government. The first is, I would argue, that food is getting rising political salience at the moment. We're hearing it, multiple government departments are kind of opening their doors and wanting to have conversations about food. Inflation is probably the biggest way into that conversation because it's such a big political headache. As of yesterday, inflation went up again. It dropped a little bit last month, but it's now it's at 4.9%. So it's still very high, food price inflation, and it's coming out in all of the polling that all the political polling that's happening. This is kind of being top of mind for voters. Is am I having to put something back when I get to the till because I've spent my budget? In parallel to that, last week we've been doing quite a lot of work around this commitment to expand free school meals, and Number 10 hosted a reception last week, the Prime Minister did, to talk about his ambitions to work more in partnership with civil society and philanthropy. And school chefs came in and served the food, cooked the food, which is a whole story in and of itself as to how that happened. But we can talk about that over drinks. So we had school chefs serving food in Downing Street and talking about why school food can be both healthy, sustainable, and that children will actually eat it as well. These are the two Department for Education ministers, with me doing a rather strange face in the middle, but that was one of the official photographs. Can't take your cameras into Downing Street, so I had to live with that one. So anyway, unusual, I would say, to have the Prime Minister talking about food in this way, and potentially also something that generates quite a lot of momentum with the Department for Education in terms of moving forward confidently with the school food standards and the scale up of free school meals. The other context, a really important context for the food strategy, is the kind of really damaged relationship between the government and farmers. That's obviously, there were a couple of things which really took us to that point, but I think there's also a sort of, stronger and stronger narrative, which is around concern that our levels of self-sufficiency are falling, that we're offshoring some of our food production for a whole multitude of reasons. Farmers are struggling to make a living, and there is also a very damaged relationship between policymakers and farming. So there's a kind of bit of context that's quite important for thinking about the food strategy. And then we have this quite challenging narrative on growth, I would say. I mean, Pete and I were just briefly talking about it, but there's obviously a singular focus on growth from the government. And we've got quite a complicated proposition when it comes to growth in food, because these are the sort of very broad and not directly comparable statistics, but this is the sort of level of growth that the food industry contributes to the economy, 153 billion in gross value add. And yet we've also got this very heavy cost attached to obesity and overweight that taxpayers or the wider society, so this is productivity losses, health and social care, is accruing. That's just overweight and obesity, of course, and poor diets contribute to a multitude of other health outcomes which are not captured necessarily through weight. But I think we've got, in terms of where we see growth in the food industry, what good growth looks like is a very kind of pertinent question to the food strategy. And if we want to see growth in some sections of the food industry, where is that? And how do we ensure that it brings down this bill at the same time and not adding further to it? That's very relevant to then the kind of proposition. So I'm going to move on now just to talk about 4 areas of policy action that we at the Food Foundation are hoping to see the government act on under the banner of the food strategy. So, and the first is around what is this good growth and where might we actually see growth in the food industry? And what we're really focused on here is fruit and vegetables, and this is just really the case for that. So first of all, most of us are eating too little fruit, veg and fibre. Only 4% of are eating our fibre requirements. We've got big inequalities in fibre, but also fruit and veg. Fruit and veg probably is the way we see the biggest socioeconomic gradients between wealthy and lower income households. And what we've seen through the cost of living, through a lot of our food insecurity measurement, is that fruit and veg purchasing is the thing that people tend to report dropping first when money is tight. At the same time, we are very dependent on importing fruit and veg and beans. Actually, I'm going to come on to beans a wee bit in a moment. But you can see these are the areas of our kind of food where we have the biggest trade deficit. So we eat only about 17% of the fruit that we eat is UK grown, and 55 for vegetables. And what we're seeing is that we're in our imported fruit and veg, we're very dependent on parts of the world that are very exposed to climate shocks, particularly water stress. The Iberian Peninsula and Morocco are all kind of good examples of that. There's a lot of work going on at the moment under the sort of banner of climateflation to really understand more about which bits of the fruit and veg sector and other parts of our food system are more exposed than others to climate shocks. So we have that exposure, and then there's been various bits of sort of analysis which have been done around, well, if we were to eat our 5 a day and we were to maintain this same level of trade deficit, what would that mean for British production? A pretty significant increase, 83%. Here in the UK, and then a sort of not broadly similar statistic coming out of the Eat Lancet diet that was published, the planetary health diet published, I don't know, a month ago or so, which basically requires the world to produce 63% more fruit and veg in order to meet the planetary health diet. So in other words, if we just think we're going to kind of get our fruit and veg from abroad to meet our gap, that's perhaps an unwise decision, recognising that it's not like we've got an overall surplus globally. So what we are proposing, really, our sort of policy ask really of the government is, and the Eat Lancet report, you no doubt many of you have read, talks quite a lot about these sort of policy bundles. So how can you group together policies to deliver certain outcomes in support of the planetary health diet? And this is probably an example of those. I'm not quite sure if that's what this is what the authors had in mind, but it's our interpretation of a policy bundle. And so really thinking right from farm to fork, what are the different policy levers that the government has to both increase the supply of fruit and veg in Britain and beans that fold that into, and then ultimately consumption. I'll just briefly touch on beans because they didn't come up previously in the previous slides, but we just launched a big new national campaign to try and increase bean consumption. It's called Bang in Some Beans. And we've been looking at a bit about what the sort of production story is, and we actually grow a lot of beans here, fava beans. We export a big chunk of them to Egypt for their delicious foul madame, and we feed the rest to animals, for the most part, a bit to the fish industry as well. And so one of the things we're interested to think about is how can we create a market for British beans, and what are the opportunities with regen agriculture for us to be looking at other varieties of beans that will also support the goals of regenerative agriculture, as well as potentially create a market for British beans. So there's opportunities for beans in here as well, which obviously is a sort of big contributor for fibre consumption. But here you've got really a mix of different things, right from, you know, R&D investment right at sort of upfront, and new product development, particularly focusing on convenient, minimally processed plant-rich foods, through to the sorts of things that are needed to boost British horticulture. So planning barriers are a big challenge. There's a whole set of things around supply chain fairness, fair dealing obligations, which are being kind of developed now under the banner of the last government, actually the Agriculture Act, which gave the government powers to develop these regulations to improve fairness across the supply chain, which is obviously very important for producers so that they can start investing more effectively in their businesses and they're not kind of constantly on a knife edge financially. Public procurement, which is increasingly becoming a conversation within DEFRA about, they've got a set of manifesto commitments to increase, well, to ensure that 50% of food publicly procured in Britain is from either local or higher environmental standards food. I'm not saying that very clearly, but and at the moment DEFRA is a bit stuck to know, well, they don't really know what the baseline figure is for a start, so they don't really know what 50%, how that compares to the baseline, but also as you'll know, public procurement is incredibly fragmented across the UK. There are, it's and very dispersed, and actually the practicalities of trying to move public procurement in the right way are pretty challenging, but very important in the mix of things that need to be done. And then at the other end, the support for access for low-income families. So this is where the government could boost Healthy Start, do more of that social prescribing that they've started to sort of signal interest in. And then stuff which is much more at the marketing end. So really thinking about, at the Food Foundation, we set up an organisation called Veg Power, which basically asked the question of, could you use the sorts of skills that the advertising industry uses to get kids excited about eating beans? And we created a TV ad. ITV gave us loads of free media space, and we ran a 6-year campaign, Veg Power did, under the banner of Eat Them to Defeat Them. If you haven't seen the ad, it's quite fun. Definitely recommend looking it up on YouTube. But basically we proved the point that you can actually get kids excited about eating vegetables if you use these kinds of tools. And therefore thinking about how you get more money in the system for spending on marketing and using those tools, not necessarily the classic kind of nutrition education from government, but the sorts of tools that the junk food marketers use very effectively, and applying them to good food works pretty well. And we're trying to move in to do the same thing. This is the logo from Bangins and Beans. As I said, that launched a couple of weeks ago. If you put that into Google and click images, you'll see all the stuff that's going on social media in support of that campaign, which is quite exciting, but still very early days on it. So yeah, lots of opportunities around fruit and veg, and I think it's just worth highlighting these stats, which have come from, goes back to this narrative around growth, which Green Alliance have developed, really looking at the opportunities that if you did increase demand for fruit and veg, in other words, you're getting closer to that 5 a day, you would also add 2.3 billion to the economy with, you know, increases in job opportunities. You could go even further if you actually tried to tackle some of the UK market share size versus, you know, imports. And the land demands are quite small, and really if you switched out the bioenergy crops, you get the same kind of level of land demand to produce that extra fruit and veg. So we're not looking at a big kind of trade-off challenge around land. And the bioenergy crops are obviously a pretty inefficient way of producing energy and require a government subsidy to make them work. So opportunities there. Okay, so the second area is what we're calling good food neighbourhoods. So we've got good food growth, first one, good food neighbourhoods. And this is really around kind of place and community. What can be done to try and tackle these very marked inequalities that we have across the UK in terms of access to affordable, nutritious food. This is just a snapshot of a new dashboard that we've created, which compiles some of these sort of diet and health inequality statistics on a constituency level. We've done that because MPs love to see the data which is relevant to their patch. And this is Wolseley, which is the constituency of the new DEFRA Minister, Angela Eagle. But basically what this data shows, and many other sources of data point to, is that we've got these very marked disparities, and some communities which are underserved on multiple levels, and where very many people are dependent on charitable food provision. And much of that provision is where people have to take what they're given. It's often a stigmatizing environment, no discredit to the amazing organizations that are doing that work, but it can be experienced as a stigmatizing experience, and is a contributor to very wide health inequalities. And I think the interesting thing that has happened as a result of this pretty devastating circumstance is that we started to see this huge growth in the number of food banks, and we still, I mean, FSA statistics show we've got about 3% of the population currently using food banks. But what we're seeing in the last few years is a shift to other models for providing broadly charitable or social retail to very low-income communities, food pantries, food clubs, social supermarkets, a whole raft of different models, often quite tailored to the communities in which they're operating, bespoke services which meet the community's needs. And there's, you know, so for example, I mean, in Leeds alone, there's about 150 initiatives which are around charitable food provision. So it's cooking and growing classes, social supermarkets, shared meals, a whole stack of things. And that picture is mirrored right across the country. And we think really that this sort of diversification of offer beyond kind of emergency support, which obviously serves a very specific function, creates potentially a social infrastructure that could be thought about as a real asset from which to expand access to affordable and very high quality nutritious food for low income communities. And often at the moment, they're not getting that high quality nutritious foods. Some are, and I'll mention a few of those in a moment. but we're hoping that would be more of a direction of travel and a bit of an opportunity. And these kind of ideas are not, this sort of social retail idea are not particularly new. We used to have British restaurants here in the UK during the war and after the war, which were public dining rooms for nutritious foods, where you have a slightly subsidised offer for everybody, very inclusive. And we've obviously seen he's no longer the candidate, he is actually the mayor of New York, who came in with a promise around state-owned grocery stores. There's a lot of conversation happening about what are these alternative models which might actually enable people to access affordable, nutritious food. And it's quite an interesting space. So we're looking at this we try and think about the food system in terms of this. We find this Berkana two-loop model quite helpful for thinking about how change is happening in the food system. We obviously got the dominant system, which we're all very familiar with. And I think we're interested in seeing how are these new models taking shape within the emergent system? What are the pioneers? Is this the building blocks of some of the emergent system that we want to see? And what needs to be done to enable some of these pioneers to connect to one another, build networks, and for those things to become stronger and more impactful and have a bigger impact, positive impact on people's lives. And so, and I'm just going to give you a few examples of things that are happening around the country, which try and bring some of this to life, really, and in different ways. And so I'm going to start with, this is near where I live, actually, Margate. I live in Canterbury, but this is Cliftonville. Cliftonville is, West Cliftonville is the 87th most deprived part of the country out of 33,000. So it's like one of the very most deprived parts of the country. They have this really pretty incredible farmers market that happens once a month, and it's not high-end kind of bourgeois kind of experience, which a lot of farmers markets are. This is a place that's for everybody. People queuing up to get fruit from the local orchards and the local kind of veg farms. So kind of thinking about, I think we've kind of got markets in a sort of a space, well, that's only for the wealthy elites. Well, it doesn't have to be. What are the policy levers that might enable markets to be more readily available for larger numbers of people? We've got this example, which is Long Table in Stroud. Some of you may know of it, and they have a kind of cross-subsidy model where some people pay and some people pay as they can for lunch and dinner. And the whole idea of it is that everybody should be able to eat good food in a social environment together. They're managing to make, and they're doing huge amounts of local sourcing in their whole model. You've got this example from Edinburgh, the Edinburgh Food Cooperative. So they make these meal kits for people. You can see the price of them. So 4 portions there for £3.50. It's all the ingredients in a bag with a recipe book, with a recipe card, and people can order online, and they're located in some of the most deprived parts of Edinburgh. Again, sourcing local ingredients for the most part. So these are kind of all examples of where actually people are making connections between smaller producers, often producing food to higher environmental standards, and trying to come up with a retail offer which is, reaching people who are on low incomes with really nutritious, good food. And there are lots of ways in which policy can start to think about how can it enable more of this to happen. We've come up with 10 policy levers, which we think across DEFRA and MHCLG, the Housing and Local Government Department, and DWP, the Department for Work and Pensions, between them have to try and enable more of this kind of stuff to happen. So that's everything from easing planning barriers for things like farm shops, urban growing, that kind of thing. That would be within MHCLG's sort of broad remit with local authorities. Thinking about new housing developments and how they embed food infrastructure within them, using the community infrastructure levy and resourcing which is generated through those development processes. Leveraging publicly owned assets, lots of empty high street premises which councils can use to make available and thereby create a sort of subsidy essentially for some of these things to emerge in prime locations. And also thinking about business rate relief to help some of the smaller businesses that might be operating in this space to get a foothold. Those are 4 of the examples. This is another example which is really interesting, and I'll explain in a moment why public procurement is such an important part of this mix. But you're probably familiar with an initiative called Welsh Veg in Schools. If you're not, it's super cool. But basically, they are really trying to work out how they can get Welsh vegetables into school dinners. Seems like a fairly obvious thing to do. Unbelievably difficult to do, and they're going through they've done, been working on it a couple of years. They've got a kind of target to get to 5% of Welsh veg in school dinners. So it's a big ambition, shows how complicated some of this stuff is, but really interesting, because what it's doing is it's driving some of those economies of scale that then mean those small producers who are going, okay, I know that I've got a certain size of market here with the schools, and that means that I can go a little bit bigger, and I can also sell into the local restaurant or the local greengrocer or whatever. And so it's creating other sort of spin-off effects, and the food kind of web is growing. And so the policy enablers around this are, of course, requiring those anchor institutions, schools, hospitals, universities. I know there's lots happening here in Oxford to source food locally. Helping to create some of those economies of scale. And in parallel to that, what this is highlighting in a lot of instances is this lack of regional food infrastructure in place, places to store food, do basic packing, basic processing. A lot of that infrastructure is nested within the big retail chains and is nowhere else, basically. So creating some of these economies of scale at a regional and local level are really difficult to do without some of that basic infrastructure. So this is the kind of our visual to try and capture some of this complexity in hopefully a slightly simpler way. So ultimately, what we're interested is, new ways of accessing affordable and nutritious foods in underserved neighbourhoods, and we think there are kind of multiple routes to market. I've illustrated a few of those with the examples from around the country. And these actors in the middle are really important for enabling that. So it's the public procurement stuff, the anchor institutions, charitable and social food enterprises, and purpose-led food businesses. So this is not just the charitable sector, it's social enterprises and into commercial sectors, a whole kind of cluster of different types of models there. And then this enabling infrastructure here. So the regional infrastructure, which I talked about, food partnerships. We have a network of 100 or so food partnerships around the country, which Sustain and the Soil Association have been doing an incredible job of leading. They bring together the actors at a place-based level to try and make some of these connections. And increasingly, we're thinking that there should be a requirement for perhaps mayors or local authorities to actually formally develop these food plans that would bring this whole picture together. And Birmingham is a great example. We're working at the moment where they're doing that at a city level. And then linking into smaller producers and farmer catchment groups. I think Minette Batter's report, which is due to come soon on the profitability of farming, is going to talk quite a bit about regional supply chains and the role of farmer catchment groups. I think that's going to become increasingly an area of interest from policymakers. So we've set this up as being about access to affordable, nutritious foods, but there are lots of other ways up to other benefits that you could potentially see from this. Obviously, kind of food culture more generally, the opportunities that it creates for strengthening social bonds, strengthening community, bringing people together around food. There's a whole host of other kind of co-benefits that could happen if we can move in this direction. This is not to say that this is ever going to really significantly challenge the dominant system, but this is about creating more diversity in people's communities so that there are other ways in which they can access food that might bring some of this wider collection of benefits to their lives, and starting with the most deprived parts of the country. So yeah, 10 policy. There's a couple of other policy enablers that I haven't mentioned here. We've got, for example, so one of the things that at the moment happens is that we have this thing called the Crisis and Resilience Fund. It was called the Emergency Support Fund. This is a big lump of money that DWP gives to local authorities to support with food banks and so forth. And at the moment, typically a food pantry or a food bank might get that money, and they get some food through the surplus off the main commercial system, so through Fair Share and the likes. But then they'll plug the gaps and they'll go to Iceland or Aldi and Lidl and they'll buy stuff and then put it on offer in the food pantry for 20% less or something like that. So that's a kind of pot of money there, which you could use to actually be more deliberate in trying to drive connections to local produce, you know, through that policy process. And then here at this end, you've got payments for farmers through ELMS and the national subsidy, but, you know, payments for environmental goods. And at the moment, for example, you can get a payment if you are hosting a school visit on your farm because it's deemed to be something good for the community and for society, right? But you couldn't get a payment if you were selling your food to a food pantry, for example, and kind of, well, why not? You know, would that be something that would be valuable? So you've got money at this end, you've got money at this end, and can you use that to try and connect and drive forward some of these connections more deliberately? Okay, so, and then a couple of other bits on policy context here, which I think are really relevant. So the government's launched this Pride in Place initiative, which is all about targeting the most deprived communities with additional investment. So that creates a little bit of interesting opportunity. You've got Tim Lang's report, Just in Case, rather than Just in Time, which is really pointing to the extent to which our system is very exposed to shocks and the need for more diversity in our supply chains that creates some buffer in the system. You've got the government launching its Office for the Impact Economy, is really interested in thinking about purpose-led business, philanthropy, impact investment. What's the sort of space here which is not the strictly commercial sector, but adjacent to it that can do good things alongside the commercial sector? And then, of course, you've got this huge juggernaut of the devolution bill and the extent to which local powers are going to get strengthened. So these all in different ways contribute to an environment where opportunities emerge for thinking about food in communities. Okay, so the third area, I'm almost out of time, and these are two quick last ones, a bit more probably familiar territory. So this is what we're calling the Good Food Incentive, and really thinking about taxes and subsidies in the system. So you'll be familiar with the junk food cycle, the extent to which this drives a situation where the easiest way to make money in the food system is by selling highly processed, unhealthy foods. And that plays out in price, where we have unhealthy calories being double the cost of unhealthy, half the price of healthy calories. And so if you're really serious about changing that dynamic, you've got to look at the financial incentive, the commercial incentives in the system. And the biggest lever, of course, the government has to do that is around taxes. Now, I think this is quite an interesting challenge from a kind of the interface between policy and politics, because talking about taxes at the moment, anything that could contribute to food price inflation or the cost of living is you know, kind of completely off limits. But at the same time, this is taxing some of the unhealthy ingredients or a number of other tax models which are being researched at the moment by academics, including Pete and colleagues with the Copper Project. Are, as I said, really pretty important if we're serious about trying to make healthier food more affordable, you know, this balance of prices in the basket. And therefore coupling taxes with some form of subsidy, whichever tool you want to use to actually implement that subsidy. I mean, the two, I think, absolutely have to go hand in hand if you're going to have any chance of landing a policy commitment in this area. And so increasingly, I think we have to kind of see the two are wedded. We've got sort of two suggestions here. One is to significantly expand the Healthy Start scheme, giving people access to discounted fruit and veg. There are other ways that you could do it, which haven't really been, you know, tested in any meeting. Seems that was going to be my team's messages there, but it's not. You know, an idea for an incentive which is much more universal, or at least reaching many more people, and perhaps tied to British produce, so you could start to actually create some of these more sort of virtuous cycles around farming and consumers, and doing better for both. And then finally, the fourth area is a good food bill. Now, this is the kind of nerdy end, really, of food policy, and one which is pretty challenging to sell politically, because at the moment, legislative time is very, very tight. And so the case for legislation has to be absolutely, very politically salient. And we're at the moment trying to really think through how do we make those arguments politically salient. But this is essentially recommendation 14 of Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy. So it's setting out policy framework for long-term change in the food system, with targets and a mandated body to track those targets and advise government on their delivery, and an underpinning optimal population diet or reference diet against which you require policy development to align going forward into the future. This, of course, the government, there were rumours in the summer that the government was thinking, or DEFRA was thinking about a white paper, which of course would be a precursor to primary legislation. It's got a bit quiet on that front now, so I think it's all to be seen whether or not this idea will start to get traction. And one of the things that I've been picking Charles's brains on is how we kind of make the case in the most effective way for some of these for this somewhat nerdy proposition to actually land. So that's the package. Good food growth, good food neighbourhoods, a good food incentive underpinned by a good food bill, hence the good food cycle. And we've kind of built a narrative really about how it will make material impacts on affordability and availability of nutritious foods for everyone now and into the future, as well as, of course, many other benefits. But these are the ones which we know are particularly of concern to policymakers. So that's it from me. I just want to say very briefly, we've got a quick bite series coming up, which is our kind of short form half-an-hour webinar series where we're looking at the sort of interface between politics and policy making in other countries. I'm going to be talking to former ministers who've navigated kind of good food policy work in a political context to try and understand how they do that, because that's a lot of what we're trying to do now, really, is land some of these issues in quite turbulent times politically. So there we go.
Thanks very much. That was absolutely great, really fascinating talk. Before we go to questions, and I'm just, while people just ruminate on what questions they want to ask, I just want to put a couple of plugs of my own in, which is to say that so far these seminar series that we've been running, we've been inviting speakers. Largely, it's been Charles, Lexi, and I kind of been coming up the speaker list. We want to open it out to the Future of Food Network and have more conveners, because then we'll get more interested and more diverse people coming in and speaking. So if you're interested in being a convener in the future, and we will give you plenty of support in this area, please do get in touch with either me or Lexi, and we can go ahead with that. Also, just very, very briefly to say is the Future of Food Network is planning to hold another symposium next year. And we want to, again, open that up to people to use that opportunity for symposium, which will be a whole day event here in the Oxford Martin School, basically set up to try and build collaborations between food researchers within Oxford. Then please do get in touch, because we're looking for people with ideas about how to make that day the most effective and the most fun. So there you go. That's while people are still online, I just wanted to chuck that in, and I apologise for that. Now,
Do you want to see people online? Is there something to do still?
it's okay, no, it's all right, but Lexi is monitoring, so do not worry, we're absolutely fine. So let me put it to the floor and ask if there are any questions for them. Okay.
Thank you. Great. My question is about one of your early slides. You had a sort of farm to fork picture with a number of policy interventions scattered across it. It struck me that those are independently good, challenging, but the real point is they have very different timelines. And so how does one synchronize across that basket of things which have different lead times and different delivery times in some meaningful way?
Good question.
Yeah, please.
I think the only way, in my mind, that you can do it is to set, where you might say, well, over the next 10 years, we want to increase fruit and veg consumption across the country by X%, and we're going to align, and you're right, they will happen at different timelines, but you sort of work under the assumption that they will in time start to support one another. And obviously you'd have to incrementally adjust them to make those connections as they get scaled up. So for example, with Healthy Start at the moment, you can basically use your voucher in kind of most shops, supermarkets and shops. But a charity, Alexandra Rose, has been trialing it, using vouchers much more in the community market space. And so you could imagine a future where if that were a more wide scale kind of option, that you could make Healthy Start adjust in that direction. So I think it would have to be kind of iterative over time, under the banner of a big target would be my instinct. But you're right, yeah, it's.
Yes, we'll take this question here, yes.
Thanks, Anna. I'm interested by the good growth slide and your take on alternative proteins or processed plant-based foods as part of that. I can see that while there's a definite benefit to minimally processed fruit and veg, beans, also there's kind of evidence that some processed plant-based products can be healthier than the processed animal-based products that maybe they're equivalent. How do you see that as fitting in? And I guess also the advantage of the potential selling point in terms of growth of the manufacturing sector, added value benefits to the economy on that front as well.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, we've been kind of thinking about this in terms of almost like industrial strategy. So like market shaping, the role of government. And do you position this as fruit and veg feels like the kind of safest and most obvious place to start, but you could go kind of minimally processed all the good things, so the whole grain, beans, legumes, like that whole package, or you could go down more of the reformulation and new product development kind of route. And I suppose I think there's a place for it all. What we're trying to work out is how there are so many things that the government needs to do and trying to work out where to start. And it might be that it's, there comes a point where that feels like it's more likely to land than fruit and veg. And I think from our perspective, we would pivot in that direction. I think the advantage of fruit and veg is that we can bring farmers with us to some extent. So yeah, I suppose it's kind of just more thinking about the political landscape at the moment. Plus, I think there has been a bit of, I think we've seen sales falling, and I think that's been a problem with the plant-based protein stuff. I think that's probably going to start to change now as meat prices are rising so rapidly and the price differential is changing. So that story could change quite soon. But I think at the moment it feels like it's, we wanted to back that horse and now it kind of feels like, it's not really a horse to back kind of thing. So I think that period needs to pass a little bit. Yeah, as well. Yeah.
One of you had a question. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, really, really interesting to see also all the different policy ideas lined up. So in line with John's questions, there's of course the need somehow to find a collaborative space to do it all, because I mean, it's not that the Food Foundation can do it all in a sense, right? And so what's your take on building these collaborative spaces? What's holding us back in the moment to achieve some of these, so to say, changes? So in a project that we are currently doing for the Wellcome Trust, we're talking to a lot of change makers, and the question or the answer we always get is, we know what to do, but there are certain systemic barriers that keeping the community from speaking with one voice to really move the needle, to implement these kind of joined up places, because we don't have a collaborative space to really develop that in more detail and also talk about, so to say, the potential trade-offs across these different, one policy might impact negatively on the ability to basically put another policy in place, and we're standing in each other's way. So what's your take on that for the British community to kind of rally together around a couple of these options?
Yeah, it's a really, I think that your question sort of applies at so many different levels almost. And I think the progress that we've made recently has been that I think we're seeing quite a lot of evidence of departments talking to each other in a way that they've not done before.
Right.
They don't necessarily it's not coming easy. Like there's a huge willingness to do it, but the practicalities of how you make it do it and how you do it in an effective way is still a work in progress, I would say. But great that there's appetite and the incentives are sort of pointing in that direction, which is good. And for the food strategy process in particular, we've worked with the Food Farming and Countryside Commission to set up a Citizens Advisory Council. Again, not quite what you're talking about here, but another forum that feels a little bit more democratic, if you like, actually getting citizens' lived experience feeding into the policy process. And the citizens at the moment are now going round 4 different regions, hearing about what's happening in different places to take ideas back to the DEFRA conversations nationally. So that's quite an exciting part of the process. And then we do quite a lot to try and build civil society, or not just civil society, but starting with civil society and then kind of go beyond to align around particular arts. That's what we've really why the free school meal campaign has been so effective is because we've really marshaled everybody together. So there are these spaces, but they're not kind of, solid in the infrastructure of policy making, if you like. They're sort of forming and then, demonstrating, then other people might copy a little bit. I think perhaps what we're not getting are good spaces where academics have a strong voice. Obviously, academics do a lot in partnership with all different actors and including lots of civil society, but perhaps not spaces where those ideas are able to be surfaced more from the research community. So I suppose my answer is I think we're making a bit of progress, but nowhere near the sort of vision that you've described. Yeah.
Now, we're going to take a couple of questions here and then I will go online because I missed the online community last time. So Mike and then Charles. So Mike.
I'd like to see that you've still got revision of the Balance of Good Health or the Eat Well guide that's now known on your slides. But I think it's really essential that we should have proper evidence-based food-based dietary guidelines revised every 5 years, as the Americans do. And do you think there's any chance of revising the Eat Well guide to take account of current science and stuff?
I mean, yeah, as I say, we're sort of lumping that within our kind of bill ask. And I mean, that was the idea that we discussed for the National Food Strategy way back. And so it's still intact in that form, as you spotted. Would we get it? I mean, I'm not seeing any. I think the conversation about the nutrient profile model is going to suck all the energy in that space into that revision process. It would be my instinct for the next 2 or 3 years, frankly, probably. So I don't really see it on the horizon. But I think if we can scoop it under a proposition for a food bill, it might have a chance of embedding itself in the future.
Excellent. Anna, that was a tour de force, and you were very modest about not saying quite how much you personally are responsible for some of the gains right in the first slide. I wanted to ask a more specific question. Towards the end, you were talking about a card that will give a discount. Could you just say a little bit more about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what we've been trying to kind of grapple with is if you take the National Food Strategy tax proposition, it generates between £2 and £3 billion a year of revenue, as well as driving reformulation, etc. in the modelling. That's the sort of theoretical modelling. And so what we've been trying to think, if to avoid a cost of living impact, could you essentially just immediately put that money back into people's pockets through a digital card that perhaps was tied to minimally processed, possibly British. I mean, we're kind of looking at different sort of ideas here that would allow most families. I mean, we've suggested anyone not in the upper income tax bracket to have access to it. So you kind of reach most people, but not the wealthiest. With a view to basically, I mean, it's a little bit that eat out to help out kind of idea, that sort of sense of the common good, eating well for a great society, supporting our farmers, that sort of idea from a kind of political perspective. It wouldn't be very large amounts of money, £3 billion spread across however many million people, did a back of the envelope, it's not very much money. But I guess what we're trying to think about is how you can create that rebalancing of prices in the basket de facto between unhealthy and healthy food. And what tool could you use to do that?
I mean, I like the idea for healthy food. I worry about mandating local purchasing for two reasons. First of all, it'll fall foul of WTO rules. And things. And secondly, there's an economic argument that if you give that incentive, you lead to less efficient UK production. So you reduce the competitiveness of the UK fruit and veg thing. So I would have a card, but actually make it just for healthy food.
Yeah, that may well be the best route through. I mean, we've just been kind of kicking around ideas really and starting to sort of trying really to get the government thinking a bit creatively about that revenue.
That one is particularly interesting because it chimes completely with what we were told when we were doing deliberative forums in Glasgow. Very, very similar.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like a card that you can give to people
Oh, okay.
locally sourced kind of food and everything like that. So I just thought
Yeah,
that
that's interesting.
really fascinating. That we have time, I think, for questions online. If there are any questions, Lexi.
So Martin had his hand raised, and I wondered, Martin, if you still had a question that you wanted to ask.
No, I think it's been answered actually. Thanks.
Cool. All right.
Any others? Hi, Ida had a question then. That's great. So I'm pleased because that means I get to ask my question. I suppose where it comes down to is, Anna, are you hopeful? Yeah, I mean, we're in an interesting time politically, I think, with lots of pressures and everything like that. And the presentation was hopeful in terms of the way we're going. But are you hopeful of that we're on a breakthrough?
Yeah, I'm really I mean, to be honest, I'm just a pretty optimistic person. I mean, I sort of think you kind of have to, in this world of like, you got to be pretty resilient campaigning for this stuff. So it takes so long, you know. I mean, creating the kind of public discourse, the media narrative, and all that. So a policy can land. It's you know, a long game. But I mean, generally, I feel at the moment that we've got doors being swung open left, right, and centre in government, and that is very exciting. So it feels like we've got genuine opportunities. I think the sector, those of us that are in the kind of campaigning civil society space who are trying to make the most of these opportunities, is pretty poorly resourced. Lots of small organisations trying desperately to work together, but with also, I mean, we wrote 40 funding proposals last year. I mean, this is not, you know, it's like we're fundraising as we go to try and do this stuff, and it's not easy. So I think at the moment we're trying to talk to philanthropy to say, look, we've got a lot of opportunities now. Back the sector, not just us, but back the sector, because we could really, you know, make them come good. So yeah, I'm pretty optimistic. Obviously, the political backdrop is another whole story. But I mean, I think the experience of the last 10 years is, you know, we've had Brexit, COVID, massive cost of living crisis. They've all been like juggernauts when it comes to food policy. But, you know, out of a crisis, you can create an opportunity for change. So I think we have to look at it in those terms. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And that's a brilliant place to end it on. So thank you very much.